He walked out of a gas station in rural Montana in 2003. His twin brother never stopped looking. November 11th, 2003 was a Tuesday, and in Hardin, Montana, Tuesdays carried no particular weight. The town sat in Bighorn County near the Wyoming border, population just over 3,000. The kind of place where the distance between neighbors was measured in miles rather than feet. Winter arrived early in that part of the state. By the second week of November, temperatures along the highway corridor regularly dropped below freezing before noon. The sky stayed low and gray for weeks at a time, pressing down on the flatlands with the indifference of a place that had never needed to be gentle. Thomas Eller was 31 years old. He worked as a long-haul freight driver for a regional carrier based out of Billings, a job he had held for 4 years after a decade of moving between construction sites, ranch work, and short-term labor contracts across the northern plains. He was not a man defined by permanence. His employer described him as reliable on the road, but difficult to reach between runs. He owned a cell phone but rarely kept it charged. He paid his rent in cash and kept no credit cards. His brother, Daniel Eller, was also 31 years old. They were identical twins, born 14 minutes apart in a small hospital outside Miles City in 1972. By 2003, Daniel had settled in Billings with a wife and a young son, working as an electrician for a commercial contractor. The two brothers spoke by phone every few weeks. They did not live close, but they were close in the way that people who have shared the same face their entire lives understand something about each other that cannot be fully explained to anyone else. Thomas had been completing a freight run from Billings to Casper, Wyoming, when he stopped at a gas station along Highway 87 just outside Hardin. The stop was logged in his carrier's dispatch system at 2:17 in the afternoon. He had called in to confirm a delivery adjustment and had spoken briefly with a dispatcher named Lori Crane, who later recalled that he had sounded normal, unhurried, and unremarkable. He mentioned that he was stopping for fuel and something to eat. He estimated he would reach Casper by early evening. He never checked in again. The freight truck was found the following morning, November 12th, parked at the gas station where Thomas had stopped. The engine was off. The cab was locked. His personal bag was inside, along with his cell phone, his logbook, and a half-eaten bag of chips on the passenger seat. The delivery cargo remained sealed and undisturbed in the trailer. The gas tank had been filled. The receipt was still tucked into the visor above the driver's seat. Timestamp 2:24 in the afternoon. Thomas Eller had fueled his truck, purchased food inside the station, and then ceased to exist in any documented record. The gas station attendant on duty that afternoon, a young man named Roy Perch, confirmed that he had seen Thomas inside the store. He described him as calm, quiet, and unremarkable. He paid cash for a hot dog, a bottle of orange juice, and a bag of chips. He did not appear distressed. He did not speak to anyone beyond the transaction. Roy watched him walk out through the glass door toward the truck. He did not watch long enough to see where Thomas went after that. Bighorn County Sheriff's Department opened a missing persons report on November 13th after Daniel Eller contacted both the carrier company and law enforcement when Thomas failed to deliver his cargo or respond to repeated calls. The report was filed as a voluntary missing adult, a designation that reflected the absence of immediate evidence of foul play. Adults in Montana disappeared occasionally by choice. Harsh winters, financial pressure, personal crises, and the sheer geography of the northern plains created conditions where a person could simply walk away from one life without announcing it. Daniel rejected that framework from the beginning. He drove from Billings to Hardin the same day the report was filed. He walked the gas station property himself, spoke to Roy Perch before investigators did, and examined the truck with the kind of attention that came not from training but from certainty. Thomas had not walked away. Daniel knew this the way he knew his own face in a mirror. His brother had no reason to disappear, no debt large enough to run from, no relationship collapsed beyond repair, no secret life waiting somewhere warmer and easier. Thomas had called in a delivery adjustment and mentioned stopping for food. That was not the behavior of a man planning to vanish. Bighorn County investigators canvassed the gas station and surrounding area. a highway patrol officer reviewed traffic camera footage from a fixed camera positioned 1 mile north of the station along Highway 87. The footage captured Thomas's truck arriving at 2:15 in the afternoon. It did not capture the truck departing. The camera's southward view was obstructed by a natural rise in the terrain. Any vehicle leaving the station toward the south would not have been recorded. One piece of information emerged from the canvas that investigators documented but could not immediately evaluate. A woman who lived in a farmhouse approximately a quarter mile east of the gas station reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck idling near the station's rear lot for an extended period during the early afternoon of November 11th. She estimated it had been there for at least 40 minutes before she stopped paying attention to it. She could not identify the make or model precisely. She could not see the license plate from her property. The dark pickup truck became the central variable in a case with very few variables. Investigators requested records from the station's interior camera system. The footage showed Thomas entering at 2:19, completing his purchase at 2:23, and exiting through the front door. The camera coverage did not extend to the exterior rear lot. No footage existed of anything that had occurred behind the building. A ground search of the immediate area was conducted on November 14th. Officers and volunteers covered the land adjacent to the station in a 1-mile grid. The terrain was flat and exposed in most directions, interrupted by a dry creek bed to the southeast and a series of low ridges to the west. Nothing was found. No clothing, no personal items, no biological evidence. By the end of November 2003, the case had reached an early standstill. Thomas Eller remained in the National Crime Information Center database. His employer preserved the freight records and cooperated fully with investigators. Daniel Eller returned to Billings with no answers and a silence inside him that felt nothing like the silences he had known before. The years that followed did not offer Daniel Eller resolution. They offered only the grinding repetition of a search maintained against accumulating doubt. He contacted Bighorn County Sheriff Department every 3 months for the first 2 years. The responses were consistent and carefully worded. The case remained open. No new evidence had been identified. He was encouraged to contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults, which he did. He submitted updated photographs and a detailed written account of Thomas's last known movements to every relevant database he could locate. Daniel's wife, Karen, supported the search without reservation in the early years. She understood that Thomas was not simply a missing person to Daniel. He was the other half of something that had no name but that both of them could feel the absence of. Their son, born in 2001, grew up knowing he had an uncle named Thomas who had disappeared before he was old enough to remember him. Daniel showed him photographs occasionally and described Thomas in the specific terms of someone determined that a person not become only a name attached to an unanswered question. In 2006, Daniel submitted a formal written request to the Montana Department of Justice, asking that Thomas's case be reviewed under the state's cold case protocol. The response acknowledged the request and confirmed that the file had been flagged for periodic review. No active reinvestigation was initiated at that time due to resource limitations and the absence of new evidence. Daniel began attending national conferences for families of missing adults in 2007. He connected with advocacy organizations that worked alongside law enforcement on cold cases involving adults who had disappeared under circumstances inconsistent with voluntary departure. Through those networks, he developed a working knowledge of investigative methodology that he had not possessed in 2003. He learned what distinguished a case with forensic potential from one that had reached a permanent wall. He learned which databases communicated with each other and which did not. He learned how to read the language of law enforcement responses well enough to understand what was being said between the careful lines. In 2009, Daniel hired a private investigator based in Billings named Frank Aldis, who had previously worked for the Montana Department of Justice. Aldis reviewed the original case file materials available to the family and conducted independent interviews with Roy Perch and the farmhouse woman, whose name was Edna Calloway, both of whom still lived in the area. Roy Perch had little to add beyond what he had told investigators in 2003. His recollection had not sharpened with time. He remembered Thomas as one of hundreds of unremarkable transactions that year. Edna Calloway was different. When Aldous visited her in the spring of 2009, she mentioned something she said she had told the original investigators but was not certain had been recorded carefully. On the afternoon of November 11th, 2003, she had seen the dark pickup truck she previously described, but she had also seen a second vehicle she had not initially considered significant. A white cargo van had been parked along the unpaved access road that ran behind the gas station and connected to a service track used occasionally by agricultural equipment. The van had been there when she looked out her kitchen window sometime in the early afternoon and had been gone by the time she looked again an hour later. She had not mentioned the van initially because she had not connected it to anything unusual at the time. Cargo vans moved through rural Montana regularly, servicing farm equipment suppliers, rural delivery routes, and utility contractors. It had not seemed worth noting until Aldous asked her specifically whether she had seen any other vehicles beyond the dark pickup. Aldous documented the information and submitted it to Bighorn County Sheriff's Department as a supplemental witness statement. The department acknowledged receipt. No immediate investigative action followed. Daniel reviewed the statement and spent the following months researching cargo van registrations connected to known criminal activity along the Highway 87 corridor. The research produced nothing actionable. Without a plate number, a make, or a model, the van was a shape without an identity. By 2012, the private investigation had consumed a significant portion of Daniel's savings without producing a breakthrough. Aldous concluded his engagement with the family honestly. He had found one additional witness detail that had not been fully explored. He had found no evidence sufficient to reopen the case through official channels. He recommended that Daniel focus his energy on ensuring the case remained active in state databases and that he continue developing relationships with advocacy organizations that monitored cold case legislative developments in Montana. Daniel followed that advice. He also did something else. He began writing, not publicly, not for an audience, but privately. He wrote detailed accounts of everything he knew about Thomas, childhood memories, the particular way Thomas laughed when something genuinely surprised him, the way he always ordered the same meal at diners regardless of what was on the menu, the way he had stood at their father's graveside in 1998 with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set and had not cried until he thought no one was watching. Daniel wrote these things because he understood something he had not fully understood in 2003. Disappearance was not only a physical fact, it was an erasure. And the only defense against erasure was memory maintained with deliberate care. In the spring of 2019, the Montana Department of Justice launched a pilot program in partnership with the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, commonly known as NAMAS, to conduct systematic review of long-term missing adult cases using updated forensic tools and expanded interstate database access. Cases were selected based on the presence of preserved physical evidence and the absence of confirmed resolution. Thomas Eller's file was flagged for inclusion. A forensic specialist assigned to the review team contacted Daniel in April 2019. She explained that the program aimed to identify cases where advances in biological evidence, processing, digital record integration, and genealogical database comparison might produce results unavailable under earlier investigative standards. The original case evidence had been preserved in Bighorn County storage. The freight truck had long since been released back to the carrier company and no longer existed as physical evidence. But two items remained in storage from the initial processing in November 2003. A partial shoe impression photographed in the dust near the station's rear lot, and a small fiber sample recovered from a fence post at the edge of the property adjacent to the service road where Edna Calloway had seen the white cargo van. The fiber sample was the item of interest. In 2003, fiber analysis had identified the material as a synthetic blend consistent with industrial work gloves or cargo strapping. That identification had produced no useful investigative direction. In 2009, the same fiber was reanalyzed using updated spectral comparison technology. The result refined the earlier identification significantly. The fiber was consistent with a specific type of cargo restraint, webbing used primarily in refrigerated transport vehicles manufactured between 1995 and 2009. Refrigerated transport vehicles. Cargo vans designed to maintain temperature-controlled environments for perishable goods. The specification aligned with Edna Calloway's description of the white van parked along the service road. Investigators submitted the refined fiber analysis to a federal database tracking stolen and illegally operated commercial vehicles across interstate corridors. The query required cross-referencing fiber composition profiles with known vehicle types reported in connection with criminal activity along northern plains, highway routes between 2000 and 2009. The search returned 3 flagged cases involving refrigerated cargo vans operating along Highway 87 and connecting corridors during the relevant period. 2 had been resolved through separate criminal proceedings unrelated to missing persons. The third remained open. In 2004, a refrigerated cargo van registered to a shell company in Wyoming had been reported abandoned near Sheridan, approximately 100 miles south of Hardin along the same highway corridor. The van had been processed by Wyoming Highway Patrol as an abandoned vehicle, with no registered owner traceable beyond the shell company. No criminal investigation had been initiated at the time. The vehicle had been impounded, held for the standard period, and eventually auctioned. Montana investigators requested access to Wyoming's archive records from the 2004 impound. The documentation included a processing inventory from the interior of the van. Among the listed items was a work glove recovered from the cargo area floor during the standard abandoned vehicle inspection. The glove had been cataloged, photographed, and stored in Wyoming Highway Patrol evidence storage as part of the vehicle inventory. It had remained there for 15 years, preserved through routine evidence retention cycles without ever being connected to an active investigation. A request was submitted to Wyoming authorities for release of the glove for forensic re-examination. The request was granted in August 2009. The glove was transported under chain of custody protocol to the Montana Department of Justice Forensic Laboratory in Helena. DNA extraction from the interior lining of the glove was attempted using low-template amplification methods developed for degraded biological samples. The process required 3 weeks. A viable genetic profile was obtained from epithelial cells present in the lining material. The profile was uploaded to the combined DNA index system and cross-referenced against federal databases. No immediate match was returned for the profile as a known contributor. Investigators then submitted the profile for genealogical database comparison through a platform authorized for investigative use under Montana's cold case protocol. The genealogical comparison process took several months. In February 2020, the system identified a significant partial match to a profile submitted through a consumer ancestry service by a woman in Casper, Wyoming. The partial match suggested a familial relationship at the level of first or second cousin. Investigators used the familial connection as a starting point to map the relevant family tree. The genealogical mapping process identified a male individual within the family network who had been born in 1968 and had lived in Wyoming and southern Montana during the early 2000s. His name was Curtis Bray. He had a documented criminal history that included a conviction for theft of commercial property in Wyoming in 1999 and an arrest on suspicion of assault in Montana in 2001 that had not resulted in charges due to a witness recanting. By 2020, Curtis Bray was 51 years old and residing in Laramie, Wyoming. Investigators conducted discreet background research before any direct contact. Employment records showed he had worked for a small regional freight brokerage in Casper during 2002 and 2004, a company that arranged transport contracts for agricultural and perishable goods suppliers. The company had since dissolved. Daniel Eller received the call in his kitchen in Billings on a TUA court-authorized DNA sample was collected from Bray in March 2020 under the pretext of a routine follow-up in an unrelated matter. The sample was processed at the Montana Department of Justice Laboratory and compared directly against the profile extracted from the glove. The match was confirmed at a statistical certainty exceeding 99.8%. Curtis Bray's DNA was inside. The glove recovered from the abandoned refrigerated cargo van found 100 miles south of the gas station, where Thomas Eller had last been seen. The van's fiber had matched material recovered from a fence post at the edge of the property, where a white cargo van had been observed on November 11th, 2003. Investigators applied for and received a warrant to search Bray's Laramie residence and a storage unit registered in his name in a neighboring county. The storage unit contained items consistent with the interior configuration of refrigerated transport vehicles, including cargo webbing of the type identified in the fiber analysis. It also contained a collection of personal documents, photographs, and papers that suggested Bray had maintained records of his movements across Wyoming and Montana over a period of many years. Among those documents, investigators found a handwritten route log covering the period between 2002 and 2009. Entries were recorded in shorthand that required forensic document analysis to fully interpret. One entry, dated November 11th, 2003, listed a location code that investigators cross-referenced against other entries in the log. The code corresponded to a notation used consistently throughout the log to indicate a stop at or near Hardin, Montana. Curtis Bray was arrested in April 2020 and charged with the murder of Thomas Eller. The charge was supported by the DNA evidence, the fiber analysis, the vehicle records, and the route log entry. It was also supported by testimony from a former associate of Bray's who had been interviewed during the investigation and who stated that Bray had, on more than one occasion in the years following 2003, made references to an incident involving a truck driver along a Montana highway that he had described in terms suggesting knowledge of a crime rather than hearsay. Thomas Eller's remains were not recovered during the initial investigation. A targeted search of rural terrain along Highway 87 south of Hardin was conducted using ground-penetrating radar and aerial imaging in the summer of 2020. In July of that year, remains were located in a shallow depression approximately 3 miles south of the gas station, in an area of scrub terrain that had never been included in the original 2003 ground search due to its distance from the primary scene. Forensic analysis confirmed the identification through comparison with a DNA reference sample provided by Daniel Eller. Thomas Eller had been found 17 years after he walked out of a gas station and disappeared from every record that had tried to hold his name. S. Day after noon in July 2020. His son, now 19 years old, was sitting at the table working through a summer course assignment when Daniel answered. His son watched his father's face change in the way faces change when confirmation arrives after a very long time. Not collapse. Not relief exactly. Something older and quieter than either of those things. Daniel drove to Hardin the following week to meet with investigators and review the documentation. He sat in the same sheriff's department building where he had filed reports 17 years earlier. The room looked different. The equipment looked different. The faces were different. But the file on the table in front of him was the same file. Thicker now. Resolved now. But the same. He asked the lead investigator a question he had been carrying for 17 years. Whether Thomas had suffered. The forensic answer was incomplete, as such answers often are. But the investigator told him what could be told. Thomas had not been left somewhere he would have chosen, but he had also not been forgotten by the people who mattered most. Curtis Bray stood trial in Wyoming federal court in the spring of 2022. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the fiber analysis, the route log, and the testimony of the former associate. The defense challenged the genealogical comparison methodology and the chain of custody for the glove. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Curtis Bray was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Daniel attended every day of the trial. He sat in the gallery with Karen and their son, who had taken time away from his second year of college to be there. Daniel did not speak publicly after the verdict. He has spent 17 years speaking through letters, through phone calls, through conferences, through conversations with investigators who sometimes listened and sometimes did not. He had said what needed to be said. The verdict said the rest. Thomas Eller was buried in Miles City, Montana, near the graves of their parents in the late summer of 2020. The service was small and attended only by family and a few people who had known Thomas before the freight routes and the long winters. Daniel spoke briefly. He described his brother not as a victim, not as a cold case number, not as a face on a missing persons database, but as a man who had ordered the same meal at every diner he ever visited, who had stood at their father's grave with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, and who had deserved to come home. In the years following the trial, Daniel worked with Montana advocacy organizations to support expanded retention standards for biological evidence collected during missing adult investigations. He testified before a state legislative committee about the role that a single preserved fiber sample and a stored work glove had played in resolving a case that had gone cold before most of the investigators involved in its resolution had entered the profession. He said the same thing in every forum where someone gave him the opportunity to speak. Preserve everything. Because you cannot know in 2003 what 2009 will be able to find inside it. Every November 11th, Daniel drove from Billings to Hardin along Highway 87. He stopped at the gas station, which had changed ownership twice and been renovated once since 2003. He did not linger. He did not make the stop a performance of grief. He simply stopped the way Thomas had stopped for a few minutes on a Tuesday in November. Then he drove home. Thomas Eller had walked out of a gas station in rural Montana in 2003 and disappeared into the silence of a case that should have been unsolvable. It had taken 17 years, one preserved fiber, one stored glove, and one brother who had never once accepted the word gone as a final answer. The truth does not always arrive on time, but it can still arrive, and sometimes that is enough. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. In a world that moves quickly and forgets easily, choosing to stay until the end of a story like this one is its own kind of witness. Thomas Eller deserved to be found. Daniel Eller refused to let him be forgotten. And the investigators who returned to a preserved fiber sample after 16 years proved that the tools we carry forward matter as much as the questions we refuse to stop asking. What we take from this story is not comfort exactly, but something more durable than comfort. Evidence preserved with care outlasts the assumptions of its time. A brother's certainty, sustained through 17 years of silence and doubt, can still change what seemed permanent. And the truth, however long it takes, tends to find its way back to the people who never stop looking for it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that persistence and memory together can outlast even the longest silences, please support this channel by pressing the like button, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing so you do not miss the stories still to come. Your support allows these voices to reach further than they could alone. Thank you for listening.